Hello, my name is Scheffer, and this is my final oral briefing on the United States and China. Formal relations between the U.S. and China began in 1844 with the treaties of Wangchia and Tianjin. These treaties followed treaties between China and European powers, such as the British Treaty of Nanjing. These treaties between the U.S. and China secured favorable trade terms for the U.S. to help compete with the European powers. The series of treaties between Western powers and China that followed the Opium Wars became known as unequal treaties due to the concessions that China had to grant European powers and the loss of sovereignty that China experienced. They left a legacy of resentment and animosity towards Western imperialism. The U.S. was differentiated from other European powers, however, due to the use of diplomacy over military engagement in China, though this was more due to American military inferiority compared to Western European powers at the time. In 1879, the Chinese Immigration and Exclusion Act represented American backlash to increased Chinese immigration in the decades since the Burlingame-Seward Treaty and the cheap labor that they provided, combined with racist views of the Chinese. This act was the first broad restriction on immigration in the U.S. The U.S. supported the Chinese Revolution in 1911 and was among the first countries to recognize the newly formed Republic of China in 1913. During the 1930s, the U.S. opposed Japanese incursions into mainland China. However, the U.S. did not take a strong stance on this because of the view that the U.S. lacked vital interests in China. Eventually, FDR signed the Lend-Lease program into law, formalizing military aid to China, along with other allied and partnered countries during World War II. Following the Pearl Harbor attack in December of 1941, the U.S. formally entered World War II, as well as a military alliance with China. The Chinese Immigration and Exclusion Act was then repealed in 1943, signaling the warming of relations between the two countries. Following the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949, the U.S. continued to support the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, who had retreated to the island of Taiwan, and severed diplomatic ties with the communist government of Mao Zedong and the newly formed People's Republic of China, based in Beijing, for the next 20 years. In the 1950s, there were a series of flare-ups in the Taiwan Strait, known as the Taiwan Strait Crises. These crises centered around two islands, Jinmen and Mazu, which are located 2 and 10 miles respectively off the coast of mainland China. These islands were used as launching pads for nationalist attacks against the mainland and were viewed by the PRC as essential to ensuring territorial sovereignty. The PRC started a bombing campaign on the two islands, which led to a mutual defense treaty being signed between the Republic of China, the Taiwanese government, and the U.S., and the eventual cessation of PRC attacks. The PRC again resumed bombardments of the islands in 1958, which ended after U.S. resupply of ROC garrisons on the island. Starting in 1955, after the first Taiwan Strait crisis, the U.S. and the PRC engaged in what became known as ambassadorial talks. These talks were based in Geneva and consisted of ambassador-level officials from each country meeting with each other. Initially, the talks were centered around the repatriation of citizens from both countries, as well as, quote, other practical matters of concern to both sides, end quote. These talks were not necessarily productive, as China would not rule out using force to reunify with Taiwan, and the U.S. would not agree to lift the embargo on China in place since the Korean War. However, they did provide an avenue for communication and were a useful tool in preventing escalation between the two countries. These talks then continued on and off until Nixon's visit to China in 1972. The rapprochement with China that took place during the 1970s was due to a myriad of reasons. These include Sino-Soviet tensions stemming from border disputes that the U.S. wished to capitalize on, and the U.S. desire to improve relations with communist governments to further its Cold War strategy of containment. Utilizing the ambassadorial talks along with back-channel diplomacy via Pakistani President Yahya Khan, President Nixon softened relations with China in 1972, becoming the first president to visit China. During this visit, a joint statement was issued, which came to be known as the Shanghai Communique of 1972. This statement reaffirmed the Chinese position that mainland China and Taiwan are not to be separated, and that the U.S. recognized that there is one China and Taiwan is part of China. The U.S. also agreed to the removal of its troops from Taiwan and that they would not support Taiwanese independence. The PRC stated that they would not normalize relations with the U.S. if the U.S. continued diplomatic relations with the Republic of China. So during the Carter administration, official diplomatic relations with the PRC began on January 1st, 1979, as well as official diplomatic relations with the ROC ending on that date. The Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan was also abrogated in that prior year, and the Carter administration committed to the One China policy that recognizes Taiwan as a part of China while affirming, quote, continued cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan, end quote. In response to the cessation of diplomatic and military relations with Taiwan, the U.S. Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 in April of that year. The TRA quickly became a point of contention between China and the U.S. due to congressional support for the continuation of supplying defensive arms to Taiwan. The act also allowed the U.S. to, quote, maintain the capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan. Since the mainland government is a communist regime and the Taiwanese government is capitalist, any use of force by the PRC would result in a change in social and economic systems, thereby solidifying the U.S. right to defend Taiwan in the face of PRC use of force. In 1972, the United States-China Joint Communique on United States arms sales to Taiwan was issued, colloquially known as the August 17 Communique. This statement clarified Chinese and U.S. positions regarding arms sales to Taiwan. Chinese officials dropped demands for a date certain for the cessation of arms sales to Taiwan, as well as both states agreeing on language affirming U.S. respect for Chinese sovereignty while affirming the PRC's commitment to continuing peaceful relations with Taiwan. Interpretations of the communique were malleable by design in order to allow each country to satisfy its audience. The Chinese emphasized the U.S. pledge to respect Chinese sovereignty and end arms sales to Taiwan, and the U.S. emphasized the correlation of arms sales reductions with continued peaceful relations between PRC and Taiwan. Starting in 1984, the U.S. also initiated military sales to China, although this soon ended in 1989. The Tiananmen Square protests from April to June of 1989 were a series of demonstrations advocating for political and economic reform. On June 4th of that year, the Chinese government violently suppressed these demonstrations, with thousands of demonstrators being injured and potentially thousands being killed. This June 4th massacre seriously affected China-U.S. relations, and the U.S. levied sanctions, suspended arms sales and high-level engagement, and China's most favored nation trade status was put into question. Notable national security-related events that occurred in the 1990s include the 1995 visit of Taiwanese nationalist leader Lee Teng-hui to the U.S. This was a reversal by the Clinton administration of a 15-year-old policy against granting visas to pro-independence Taiwanese leaders and led to China recalling its ambassador for a year. And then also the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during its campaign against Serbian forces in Kosovo, which this led to anti-U.S. demonstrations by the Chinese. In 2000, the U.S.-China Relations Act was signed into law, establishing normal trade relations between the two countries. This helped pave the way for eventual Chinese ascension to the World Trade Organization, which it accomplished in 2001. Escalation was avoided after a collision in 2001 between a U.S. reconnaissance jet and a Chinese fighter jet, which resulted in the death of the Chinese pilot and the detention of 24 U.S. service members for 12 days in China. In 2008, China became the largest holder of U.S. debt, surpassing Japan, and in 2011, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton articulated a pivot to Asia strategy. This strategy emphasized increased investment in the Indo-Pacific and signaled a shift away from focusing on the Middle East and Europe. In 2012, the Obama administration placed additional emphasis on this region with its pivot to East Asia regional strategy. Since Xi Jinping took control of the Chinese Communist Party and became the president in 2012, bilateral tensions have increased. In 2014, the U.S. indicted 4 Chinese individuals for stealing trade secrets from American companies. President Trump started a tariff war in 2018. A Chinese telecommunications executive was arrested in that same year, and the U.S. campaigned against European use of Chinese 5G infrastructure. Most recently, as we all know, President Trump has reignited the trade war with China, levying tariffs upwards of 145% on China, and China retaliating with tariffs around the same amount. In regard to current bilateral relations, I'll be going over different aspects of the U.S.-China relationship. First, we'll cover the political relationship. The US has many human rights complaints against China, most notably the labeling of Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs as a genocide. In 2020, the first Trump administration ordered the Chinese consulate in Houston to close due to accusations of being a hub of espionage, and the Chinese government ordered the US consulate in Chengdu to close in response. That same year, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the era of engagement with China was over. Tensions continued to increase in 2022 after China refused to condemn the Russian war in Ukraine. Additionally, Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the first time a U.S. Speaker of the House visited the island since 1997. And then in 2023, the U.S. Air Force shot down a suspected Chinese spy balloon off the east coast of the United States, again inflaming tensions. The Biden administration articulated a three-pillar strategy consisting of investing in domestic industry, technology, and infrastructure, aligning with allies and partners to oppose China's increasing aggression, and competing with China globally. After a gap in high-level engagement due to rising tensions and the COVID-19 pandemic, in-person meetings resumed in 2023, with Secretary of State Antony Blinken meeting with Xi Jinping in June of that year, as well as meeting with him in April of 2024. Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen also led an economic delegation to Beijing in August of 2024. Economically, President Xi has expressed skepticism about market reform and has pursued a policy of state control. Bilateral economic interactions are becoming more competitive, specifically regarding cars, electric vehicles, electronics, and e-commerce, all of which China is steadily increasing its market share in. Citing this increase, U.S. firms believe that the field of competition is increasingly tilted to their disadvantage because of the growing role of the Chinese state in supporting domestic firms over foreign ones. Chinese support of domestic firms can be attributed to the Made in China 2025 policy. This policy is a Chinese goal established in 2015 of achieving global dominance in high-tech sectors and reducing Chinese reliance on foreign technologies. The securitization of economic relations has also been a more recent development, in which economic challenges now assume national security identities when they were previously outside of this purview. An example of this can be seen in President Trump's May 4th announcement that he will implement tariffs on foreign films since they are a source of messaging and therefore fall under national security. And finally, the trade war started during Trump's first term intensified in in April of 2025, with the Liberation Day announcement of hiked tariffs and the additional tariffs levied in the following weeks. Culturally, 75% of Chinese respondents felt that bilateral relations had deteriorated just prior to the 2020 election. This number dropped to 63% after Biden's election. I would speculate, however, that there is again a rise in this percentage following Trump's first 100 days in office. Since the initiation of the 2018 trade war and the deterioration in bilateral engagement, there has been a significant decoupling of science and education exchanges. Militarily, both the US and China emphasize the importance of maintaining military-military communications as a stabilizing force. Partially due to rising tensions, but also due to the pandemic, in-person mill-mill contact had not occurred since 2020, but resumed after Xi and Biden met in San Francisco in 2023. Cooperation has continued into the Trump administration, with a Chinese Defense Ministry spokesperson stating that there are preliminary plans being made for exchanges with the US within the foreseeable future. A notable point of military cooperation has been the two memorandums of understanding. These bilateral agreements ensure reciprocal notification of national security-related information, reciprocal observation of military exercises and activities, and they promote safe encounters between the two militaries at air and sea. While both Chinese and U.S. officials argue that specifically the rules and behavior for safety of air and maritime encounters memorandum has been effective, there were still 9 encounters over a 3-month period in 2020. Bilateral exercises have been limited to the U.S.-China Disaster Management Exchange since 2017. The U.S. and China have engaged in multilateral military exercises, however, in Australia, Mongolia, and Thailand. The very limited multilateral cooperation includes counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden also. Now, within Congress, there are competing responses to China's growing military capabilities. Some advocate for the U.S. to prioritize maintaining military supremacy in the Indo-Pacific in order to maintain deterrence capabilities in the region. Others, however, argue that expectations of maintaining military supremacy are unrealistic given China's growing military resources and the home field advantage that they enjoy, and that the U.S. should focus on working with regional partners in alliances like AUKUS or the Quad. In regards to high tech, China is the US's biggest competition. Of the emerging technologies that could have a disruptive impact on U.S. national security that were outlined in Biden's 2022 National Defense Strategy, virtually all are areas of competition with China, specifically artificial intelligence, hypersonic weapons, and quantum technology. The Made in China 2025 policy advances investment and expands infrastructure for many key high-tech industries like green energy and semiconductor chip manufacturing. And this is in order to move China from a low-cost manufacturer economy to a direct value-added economy. She has prioritized state subsidization of these sectors, impacting global firms and putting them at a disadvantage both within China and in markets that China has access to. The US has employed efforts to prevent Chinese technological advances like export controls on semiconductors and 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. And then China obviously retaliates to these American and Western restrictions by using tools like export controls on rare earth minerals. Now, this sector specifically exemplifies the West's reliance on China for high-tech manufacturing. According to the International Energy Agency, China controls 61% of rare earth production and 92% of rare earth processing, presenting a serious supply chain problem for the US and its allies. The state of intelligence sharing between the US and China is virtually non-existent due to rampant fears and accusations of counterintelligence and economic and cyber espionage. US intelligence agencies view China as the greatest threat to the US, with the FBI saying that Chinese intelligence efforts are their top counterintelligence priority, and the CIA actively recruiting Chinese officials to spy for the US. China constitutes the highest number of espionage incidents of any country, including Russia. The Center for Strategic and International Studies does note, however, that the recent rise in cases from China could potentially be due to an increase in reporting rather than an increase in incidents. The US and China have seemingly opposite policies regarding international institutions. Xi aspires for an expanded role in them, while Trump advocates for more isolationism. Xi has called for China to lead the reform of the global governance system. This consists of supporting international institutions that are value aligned with their goals, while establishing alternative organizations when rules and norms do not support their priorities. Presidents Bush and Obama viewed Beijing as a responsible power and support for global governance and norms. It's now generally agreed that China is indeed a revisionist power, however. Trump challenged this responsible power label and accused China of using international institutions to push for their own foreign policy goals. Under Xi, China has been promoting a more multipolar world and has used the US retreat as an opportunity for increased influence in global governance. For example, Chinese officials now lead 4 of the 15 UN organizations. Additionally, Trump's use of economic interdependence as a weapon in the name of national security erodes trust in Western-led institutions and increases support for Chinese institutions like the Belt and Road Initiative for Development, BRICS for global trade, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for regional cooperation. With its newfound influence on global governance, Chinese goals are both defensive and offensive in nature. These goals include preventing criticisms on human rights issues within China, preventing Taiwan from gaining an independent role in international organizations, and protecting Beijing when it comes to issues challenging its sovereignty, as well as advancing its own political developmental models of state control over politics, society, and markets. Going forward, my bold strategy would not appear that different from Biden-era strategies, save for a few exceptions. Primarily, it is essential to deter Chinese adventurism. This deterrence would best be achieved by modernizing and strengthening elements of existing systems in the Indo-Pacific, consisting of economic, legal, and security arrangements. Utilizing regional partners and allies is essential in maintaining military supremacy in China's home field. To better cultivate relationships, increase bilateral cooperation with regional actors, attendance at regional summits, and stronger economic arrangements within the Indo-Pacific are vital. The U.S. should also advocate for bilateral engagement on vital issues such as climate change, poverty alleviation, and trade agreements. Working together with China on these fronts would increase U.S. soft and hard power and then limit the soft power that China is able to build with policies like its Belt and Road Initiative. One area that I would divert from the Biden administration on is to work on reforming global institutions with China and other global South countries. Not only domestically, but globally, it is clear to so many that the status quo is not sufficient and that institutions, organizations, and norms need to be altered to include the voices of the marginalized. Working with China would help to discourage the formation of new organizations that omit U.S. perspectives and influence completely. Organizations that could be reformed could include the UN Security Council, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. Reforming these institutions in collaboration with the Global South, and yes, China, would undermine Chinese attempts at creating alternate institutions like BRICS and policies like the Belt and Road Initiative that leave out Western perspectives. Investment in reshoring or friendshoring manufacturing of key high-tech sectors to strengthen supply chains is also essential in securing manufacturing capabilities and maintaining the ability to develop the most advanced technology in the world. Finally, the U.S. needs to signal a willingness to take risks to more effectively deter China from aggressive action in the South China Sea. Warnings and rhetoric only get so far, and the U.S. needs to show China that we are willing to take risks to maintain certain global norms like the freedom of the seas. Here are the slides with my resources. Thank you everybody for watching, and I hope that you all have a great summer.